Hello, good morning. We're just getting the last few people into the meeting. If you can just bear with us, we'll be with you soon. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ERSA event, Youth Employment, Good Work and Opportunities for All. We're expecting a few more people, but we will start very soon. I think it's worth saying that today is a day of collaboration. It's a day to set some context of the challenge we have ahead of getting young people into work and into good jobs and jobs that progress into careers. It's also, we're going to look at some of the policy landscape and some of the constraints and opportunities and the wider world that we are working in. I'm delighted that later in the day we will be introducing the ERSA bursary awardees, and they are the organisations that have been selected to have ERSA membership for 12 months that is funded by the Youth Futures Foundation. I'd like to thank the Youth Futures Foundation for their ongoing support of ERSA's work in the youth employment space, and it's really enabled us to do many new things like the Kickstart Forum, the Youth Hubs Forum, and events like today. Today will be slightly smaller, or in fact indeed smaller, than some of the other youth events we've held. We're not expecting the 325 attendees that break teams or whatever. What we're expecting is a small select group that are organisations that are practitioners in the field. So shortly, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr Calum Carson, who's going to set some context. I can see Calum is with us. And later we've got Chris Goulden from Youth Futures. We've got LJ from Youth Employment UK. But we really, really want you to contribute, to collaborate with others, to network, to open up your screens and your microphones. And if for the first sessions, whilst Callum's speaking and whilst Chris is speaking, you could keep your cameras off, but the rest of the time, please do open up, speak, share, meet each other. And beyond this event today, when we get to the point where we can all meet again, we will start meeting as the ERSA Youth Forum, but for now we're online. Anyway, Welcome everybody, and over to my colleague Calum.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Morning, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen and turn my video off because my Wi-Fi hates me. So hopefully everybody can see that. Could someone just tell me if they can?
Yes. Yeah.
That's perfect, thank you. Okay, so welcome to the first session of today's event, in which I'm going to provide a bit of scene setting for the discussions to come later on this morning and this afternoon by having a look at the current challenges for young job seekers in the labour market today and some of the main issues that we all have a hand in tackling as a sector. So just a little background, bit of background on me. My name's Calum Carson. I've been at ERSA for a few months now as a labour market and policy officer after making the switch from the academic world to the policy one. And it seems like I've joined the sector at a very busy time, so apologies if I've missed anything massive in this briefing. Perfectly happy to be corrected at the end if so. So I thought I'd start us at the most up-to-date point, i.e. the latest official labour market data released this week from the Office for National Statistics and what it tells us about the current challenges for youth employment in the UK. So at a general level, the data shows that the jobs market has been broadly stable in recent months, but that from September to November at the end of last year, unemployment hit 5%, with redundancies at a record labour market high of 395,000, and including the largest annual increase in redundancies since 2009. More recent weekly data, also released, however, suggests that redundancies may have now hit their peak for the moment, with a tentative pickup in hiring over the past few weeks as the economy slowly begins to reopen and as lockdown restrictions continue to be lifted. Employment also rose and unemployment fell at the beginning of this year, while vacancies increased by 16% month on month up to March, albeit with a 14% gap to pre-COVID levels still to be made up. So on a broad level then, the figures show a pretty steady labour market both during the third lockdown and as we continue to slowly emerge from it. Beyond the top line statistics, however, the real story of this release is what they show us about the challenges facing young people in the labour market today. Most especially, they show a new record low for the number of under 25s in work, with the number of young people claiming unemployment benefits now breaching 500,000 for the first time ever. Long-time youth unemployment also rose to a 5-year high, in stark contrast to employment rises for all other age groups. Young people now account for 57% of the fall in employment, but just 12% of overall employment, and with long-term youth unemployment also up. The data also shows that in the year to March, 811,000 payroll jobs were lost in the UK, with under 35s accounting for over 80% of these cuts. And some regions of the UK have also been more affected than others, making this a geographically unequal crisis on top of a generational one. More than 1 in 5 in parts of Blackpool are now claiming unemployment benefits, for example, while claimant rates have risen by 10 percentage points in parts of London, such as Haringey and Leeds. And I believe I saw an article yesterday that said London is now the unemployment capital of Britain, which is quite surprising. Young people have also lost out due to the specific sectoral and occupational effects of this crisis, especially the impact on the hospitality, care services, leisure and construction sectors. This means that young workers in these sectors are also more likely to have been furloughed, leaving the jobs of a higher number of younger people in limbo until this September when the job retention scheme ends. Or to steal a perfect line from Fiona Ulrich of the Learning and Work Institute in an event held this week, young people tend to be underrepresented in the sectors that will recover quickest from the pandemic and overrepresented in those that will recover slower. And across the length of the pandemic more broadly, youth unemployment rose faster between spring and autumn 2020 than at any point since the financial crisis in 2008. 16 to 24-year-olds also account for a disproportionately large share of the fall in employment that's occurred over the past year, at 57%. And since the pandemic began, young people have been more likely than their middle-aged counterparts to have lost working hours, experienced lower pay, been put on furlough, or have lost their job. So the challenge right now for young people in the labour market is severe, to say the least, and is something that is extremely important for us to retain a focus on as we move into the next stage of recovering from the socio-economic impact of the past year. What makes these challenges even more daunting is that the setbacks to young people in the labour market that have been caused by COVID-19 have been layered on top of pre-existing inequalities already faced by job seekers in this age bracket, rather than replacing them. For example, during the decade before the pandemic, younger people would experience lower rates of pay growth and higher rates of working in the country's lowest paid sectors, such as retail, hospitality, and arts and leisure, compared to their predecessors while at the same age. And going into the pandemic, the share of 18 to 24-year-olds working in one of the hardest hit sectors was more than twice as large as the share of 25 to 65-year-olds that did. A resolution report released this week called Uneven Steps, which I'll put a link into the chat later on with a link to, also found that in many cases over the past year, conditions have deteriorated most among those young people whose pre-pandemic employment position had already been weakest. And I think it's important to reflect on these pre-existing inequalities and take them into consideration when looking at the challenge for youth unemployment over the next few months and years, rather than seeing the pandemic as something that has replaced old inequalities with new ones, so that the scale of the challenge isn't underestimated or only seen in a partial light. In relation to this, one of the most important points of difference that we are always keen to make is that young people, in quotation marks, aren't just one subset of the population, but rather made up of a series of distinctly separate groups and individuals, all with their own different needs and pre-existing challenges within the labour market. These include many groups who may already have been facing other structural disadvantages in securing work before the pandemic, including single parents and carers seeking to balance employment needs with their caring responsibilities, Black and ethnic minority job seekers, and workers with a disability of some kind. In the next session, Chris will talk more about the findings of the most recent Youth Futures and Institute for Employment Studies report, which explores the disparities in outcome between young people in more detail. But more generally, I think it's important to highlight that just talking about what young people as one grouping can often hide structural inequalities within this cohort, as well as between generations more broadly. The UK jobless rate for young Black people, for example, has risen by more than a third to 35% during the course of the pandemic. Another of the things that we're keen on emphasising at ERSA is that finding people jobs is only half the battle, and that the working conditions of these jobs is almost as important as the roles themselves in many cases. This can include ensuring that jobs are paid at a rate that enables workers to afford a decent standard of living, for example, by being paid at real living wage rates of pay, or including an adequate number of regular working hours in any given week or month to avoid the effects of in-work poverty, seen quite recently in the Living Foundation's launch of the Living Hours accreditation campaign, alongside their real living wage one. Such efforts are even more important after a year in which those at the bottom of the income scale have been the hardest hit by the economic fallout of the pandemic, with low paid workers experiencing double the rate of work disruption than staff who are not low paid. And as precarious and insecure forms of employment becoming ever more widespread across the labour market, you can see this in the recent Supreme Court cases against Uber and the ongoing strikes against Deliveroo. There's a real need right now as we come out of the pandemic to highlight the value of decent work for all, before such roles become the norm for even more young workers across the UK. Given the scale of these challenges in tackling high levels of youth unemployment, we are happy to see that the government have recognised this through the introduction of Kickstart, providing funding to create new jobs for 16 to 24-year-olds on UC who are at risk of long-term unemployment. Many of those here today will have had some interaction with the programme as it continues to ramp up and roll out, and its existence will make a big impact in both tackling youth unemployment and on keeping a clear focus on this area as we move forward. However, we were also disappointed to not see the Chancellor announce an extension to the programme in the most recent budget, with Kickstart still scheduled to end in December 2021. There have been real challenges rolling out Kickstart in the expected timeframe, alongside restrictions on businesses that have delayed opportunities getting to young people. And we believe that the slow rollout of the scheme to date means that an extension to the end of 2022 would help to maximise the programme's ambition of supporting young people seeking employment. So while the lack of an extension is disappointing, we will continue to campaign for this alongside others in the sector, such as the Youth Employment Group, as well as organisations across the country more widely, such as the CBI, who have called for an extension to July of next year, I believe. There have also been calls for policies that go beyond Kickstart 2, particularly for a youth guarantee that would offer all young people a job, training place, or apprenticeship in some form. We don't envision that happening anytime soon. We're also clear that it is vital that the government strengthens the social security net for workers so that people can get the support they need during this time, beginning by reversing plans to cut essential universal credit payments by £20 per week in September and removing the threat of sanctions for those looking for work at the moment. Of course, the real challenge still immediately ahead of us, beyond the easing of lockdown restrictions, is what will happen to the labour market and employment prospects for young people once the government's job retention scheme ends in September, and how many of those currently counted as employed will lose their jobs once furlough is formally withdrawn. And while tracking changes in the current employment data is important, we need to remember that they also aren't given the full picture, as furloughed workers are still counted as employed. And in reality, there's a very large employment gap to make up. The Resolution Foundation have emphasised that the UK labour market currently still has a COVID employment gap of 6.2 million people who still need to get back to work. And that unless this gap is closed before the furlough scheme ends in September, we could see a severe rise in unemployment later this year, and among younger workers in particular. Sectors employing a higher number of young people are also the same sectors most reliant on the furlough programme, such as retail and hospitality, also making the prospects for millions of young workers in a post-furlough labour market highly uncertain at present. Current estimates, unemployment remains on course to peak towards the end of 2021, once furlough expires and those who stopped job hunting during the pandemic look to return to the workforce as restriction ease. That's just one projection though. And although the furlough scheme has most likely limited the peak in job losses, the longer term structural unemployment caused by COVID-19, particularly for younger workers, will mean that the road back to pre-pandemic levels lags behind the wider economic recovery, most likely. And as we prepare for these circumstances to emerge, it is also important that employment support services that have been moved online on a more permanent basis following the past year do not exclude any young people with particular access or barriers to seeking help from finding that support in their search for jobs. There are concerns too about the scarring effects on a longer term basis for young workers. Past research has shown that those who enter the labour market during a downturn carry the cost of doing so into middle age in the form of lower wages and a higher risk of unemployment. So this is something that should not be underestimated or ignored in our response to the crisis. The long-term scarring cost to young people entering the labour market in 2021 in terms of lost earnings and damage to employment prospects has been forecast by the Prince's Trust and the Learning and Work Institute to be 14.4 billion over the next 7 years if current trends continue. And here at ERSA, we will continue to follow these developments closely as they emerge and to play our part in bringing the sector together to make sure that we react to and challenge and tackle these challenges head on as best we can. So I hope that's given you a hopefully not too depressing crash course in the context for this event. We're in a rapidly changing economic and policy environment at the moment. So as we carry on navigating our way through this crisis, it would be great to hear what you have to say and whether I've missed anything completely. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Calum. I'll let you continue to host it. I was just checking whether I was supposed to be at the light, but carry on, Calum. Open up your camera, etc.
Yeah. Can't see any hands raised so far. But if anyone wants to jump in, feel free. Oh, and I will share the slides, Heather, absolutely. Yes, Gavin.
Hi, Calum, can you hear me?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, great. I think you mentioned there's a disparate, there's the hardest hit, and then those who were previously struggling before the pandemic began. Do you have any sort of figures and data, particularly those who are, going back from the 15% of the population are neurodiverse, and so likely they are the ones to be hardest hit in terms of already struggling within that space. And a percentile of those, maybe 2%, are actually employed in the wider population. But that leaves 13% still battling to try and engage in work and trying to engage. And how do you see that going forward with the current policy changes? As you said, it's quite a dynamic, a dynamic system at the moment.
Yeah, I think retaining a focus on that is key at the moment. We talked a lot in ERSA about making sure that those who are already disadvantaged in the labour market before the crisis are the ones most emphasised now in the recovery time. I know a lot in our last conference in February, we talked a lot about the lack of mental health provision and wraparound support in government policies. So those are the things that I think we're going to continue to emphasise. I was thinking of devising some sort of resource, bringing all of that together and really emphasising it. The House of Lords Youth Unemployment Committee has a consultation out at the moment, for example. So I think we're going to put something in about that on there.
I'm happy to contribute to that, and I think we can work together with that. I have a developmental pathway through my research. As you know, I'm an academic at London South Bank, so let's talk about that.
That would be great.
Let's engage, do something about that.
It's always nice to retain my academic links as well.
Yeah, no, you're always welcome to connect with us. Yeah,
that's great. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, Deborah. You there, Deborah? Not sure if there's a connection issue. If you can't speak, Deborah, you can always put your question in the chat. Issues of mental health for young people and difficulties of getting them out. Yes, absolutely. That's another area we want to focus on. I know the Prince's Trust have done a lot of work around that in terms of their youth index. So that's something that we'll likely try and be linking into a lot more, especially as the money from the Youth Futures Foundation has enabled us to look more into these kind of areas more than we could in the past. Tony, are you there?
Hi, Callum. Thanks very much for your slides there, and all your insight as well. I'm not sure whether this is the right place to talk about this, but you did raise Kickstart and how that's playing out across the country, and I'm just wondering whether we've got any sense at the moment between the kind of classic supply and demand issues between the labour market and the opportunities that are out there for people. I hosted a webinar yesterday on Kickstart in Birmingham, and one of the things that came out of that is that there's quite a lot of Kickstart vacancies out there, but they're not seeing the level of interest from young people. And I'm not sure whether that's a picture across the country, but it's an interesting one. I'm just wondering what else are we learning about how Kickstart is playing out.
I think we're still an evolving field, to be honest. Elizabeth might be able to come in on that. Oh, I think she is coming in on that.
Here I am. It's interesting. It's a very astute observation. One of the things that we're picking up at the Kickstart Forum and through that community of good practice that we've developed is that it's really crucial that the frontline work coaches in the job centres know about and understand the Kickstart vacancies and know and understand their caseloads and get the right people to the vacancies. So we get given some brilliant examples of the right young person in the job and the chance of sustainable employment, but we're not quite there yet. And so I think my call would be to people who are Kickstart gateways or involved with the ERSA thing is to just share that good practice of how you've made sure that frontline staff know about your vacancies, and there are lots of rules around Kickstart. You can't advertise the vacancies yourselves or whatever, but you can just tweet about it. You could put it on social media. We're really proud to have some Kickstart vacancies, what they are, talk to your work coach. That I've seen that happening and happening well. So it is an issue. It's one we're all working on, and we're just going to have to keep with Kickstart right till the end because it's a great opportunity. Yeah. I think it was announced at such pace and everybody's running to catch up ever since. Okay, thanks, Tony.
Thank you.
I think that's why the forums are so important as well, to keep that conversation going, because things are changing all the time. Access to the DWP is also incredibly useful. Deborah, are you back now? No. Okay. Gavin, did you have your hand up again?
I was just going to come in on Tony's comment there. I was just on a forum yesterday, and there were people from KPMG, they're young people who've won awards, and maybe Tony could pick up with them. From Helen Jones from KPMG, David McIntosh from KPMG, and Sobin Randall from Multiverse. And they're all leading on youth development at the moment, and youth inclusion with intersectionality. So that means youth who are coming from deprived backgrounds and moving them into apprenticeships, into the apprenticeship sector. So that may well be something to consider, that they may want to consider. Tony may want to touch base with them. So they are leading at the moment in KPMG. That's David McIntosh, Helen Jones at KPMG, and Sobin Randall at Multiverse on the apprenticeship front. But they also may well be really good to touch base with from a Kickstart point of view. So that's a comment I'd like to just add there.
That's great, thank you. I'm sure Tony will be making a note of that as well. I know he's put his email address in the chat as well. Deborah, do we have you now? I think I saw your face pop up.
You do?
Ah,
hello. I was sorry, and I'm not sure if it's been, I've just had to log out and come back in again. I wanted to ask what others have been finding as to somebody actually taking responsibility and starting some action. We've found that we've got a great many organisations saying we've got this offer, but nobody's actually started anything yet. We've got Kickstart, it just seems to be, there's an inertia around it, and local authorities seem to be, well, we want to get involved, but we don't want to lead and we don't want to do it, but we'll jump in if someone else takes responsibility. I just fear that by the time we get to December, we won't actually have started anything. That's my first thing. I just wondered if other people had found that as well. And the other one is, I'm glad you mentioned that young people are subsets, because what we're finding is we keep going back to those that have had the poorest schooling, the ACEs, you know, they've got a lot of other things going on. Historically, that's the jobs they've been able to get.
Yeah.
And what I fear is if these schemes don't put that right, so almost take them backwards before they go forwards, we'll just be in a cyclical round of, you know, feast or famine with this particular group. And as I work for a housing association, I can absolutely tell you that whether they're 20, 50, and I've got an awful lot of people being made redundant in their 50s and 60s now, that the same issues have led to them having to work in those sectors because it's the only sectors that will take them on as employees.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly good points. I think on the first one, I can't speak for other people. My sense at the moment is that we're in a kind of wait and see period for a lot of people. And that there are a lot of people that are kind of waiting for the Community Renewal Fund to come through. They're waiting for Kickstart to really ramp up, restart, and maybe that's why initiatives aren't happening. I know we've got a lot of Slack built into the program today for people to talk and network. So maybe that's something to discuss with other people on the call then. On the second point, yeah, I think that you know the segmentation issue is key, because otherwise the people who already have a few kind of advantages within the young people cohort are the ones that will, you know, do better, and the people who were left behind before will get left behind again. So I'm really keen on making sure ERSA and the sector in general, you know, really retains a focus on keeping a real need to look at the most disadvantaged in the labour market and make sure that they don't come out of this pandemic with even worse outcomes than they had before. Okay, I don't see any more hands up, so I guess I could hand to Chris for the next section, for the next session. Are you there, Chris?